Imagine a woman kneeling on a stone floor, her wrists bound behind her, while a man reads a list of her neighbor's suspicions aloud. A list that includes the fact that her bread rose too quickly last spring. That was sometimes all it took. A little too much luck, a little too much skill. A cow that sickened the same week you argued with its owner. In some villages, across parts of Europe, over 300 years, that kind of small, ordinary coincidence could end a woman's life. Hi friends. Tonight, we're going somewhere quiet and old, back to the villages and courtrooms of early modern Europe, to sit for a while with the women who were called witches, not to frighten you, just to understand them. To see the rooms they lived in, the neighbors they knew, the small daily frictions that, in the wrong year, in the wrong town, could turn into something much larger than themselves. So if you like, dim the lights now, pull a blanket over your shoulders. Let your body settle into the mattress the way tired travelers settled by a fire, centuries ago, glad simply to be warm. Nothing here needs your alertness, only your company. Let's begin. Picture a small village, perhaps 400 people. One church, one well, one baker, one midwife. Everyone in this village knows everyone else's business, not out of malice, but because there is no other way to live when your survival depends on your neighbors. You share a harvest, you share a well. You share the same 3 or 4 roads leading in and out of town. In a village like this, a woman's reputation isn't a private matter. It's a kind of currency. It determines whether people trade with her, whether they let their children near her, whether they call her when a baby is due to arrive at 3 in the morning. Many of the women later accused of witchcraft held one of 2 kinds of reputation. Either she was the woman everyone quietly respected and quietly resented, the healer, the midwife, the one who could set a broken bone or bring down a fever with herbs boiled in a clay pot over a low fire, or she was the woman everyone quietly avoided, poor, old, alone, a widow with no sons to defend her, living at the edge of town in a one-room cottage with a leaking roof, surviving on charity she was resented for needing. You can hear, if you listen, how both of these women could end up in the same place. The healer's danger was her skill. If her tinctures worked, people called it a gift from God. If they failed, if a child died anyway, if a fever didn't break, people quietly wondered if the gift had another source. The poor widow's danger was her need. If she knocked on a door asking for milk or bread and was turned away, and that household's cow died the following week, someone, somewhere, would remember the knock. Neither woman needed to do anything wrong. She only needed to be nearby when something else went wrong. Let's sit with the healer for a moment. In her cottage, the walls are close together, perhaps 12 feet across, no more. A single window, shuttered against the wind, lets in threads of gray daylight. Bundles of dried herbs hang from the low ceiling beams. Chamomile for sleeplessness, yarrow for wounds, rue for stomach pain. Her hands, when you imagine them, are cracked from years of grinding roots with a stone mortar, cracked from cold water hauled twice a day from the well. She charges little for her remedies. Sometimes nothing at all, sometimes a few eggs, a length of cloth, whatever a family can spare. She has delivered perhaps 60 children in her lifetime. She has sat with the dying more times than she could count, holding their hands through the last hours, the fire in the hearth burning low and orange, the only sound the wind pressing against the shutters. For 30 years, this made her beloved. It only took one bad season to make her suspected. Here's something you might not expect. In most places, and most years, an accusation of witchcraft didn't come from a stranger, and it didn't come from a church official with a grudge. It came from someone the accused woman had known her entire life. A neighbor, a former friend, sometimes even a relative. Historians who've studied surviving trial records, thousands of pages of testimony, painstakingly kept by court clerks with careful, cramped handwriting, have noticed the same pattern again and again. An accusation usually followed a specific, ordinary conflict, a refused loan, an argument over a shared fence line, a denied favor. Someone asks the healer for help, and she says no, perhaps because she's exhausted, perhaps because she genuinely believes the illness is beyond her skill. The person who asked feels slighted. Weeks later, their child falls ill, or their livestock dies, or their milk curdles before it should. And the mind, searching for a reason, a shape for its fear, remembers the refusal. This is worth sitting with gently, because it tells you something true, and a little sad about how fear works. It doesn't need evidence. It only needs a story that feels complete. A refusal, followed by misfortune, feels like cause and effect, even when it is only two unrelated things that happen to sit near each other in time. You can imagine the accuser lying awake at night. Not cruel, not plotting, just frightened, their child's fever climbing, their only cow, the one that fed their family through winter, lying dead in the field, in a world without knowledge of germs, without any understanding of how disease spreads through water or air. Someone had to be responsible, and it was far easier, far less frightening, in its own strange way, to believe a neighbor had cursed you than to believe the universe was simply senselessly cruel. There's a dry kind of irony in this, if you look for it. The healer, so often the person a village turned to for control over the uncontrollable, became the explanation for what she could never actually control at all. Once an accusation was spoken aloud, to a neighbor, to a local magistrate, to a priest, the woman's daily life narrowed almost immediately. Word moved through a village of 400 people the way water moves downhill, quickly and always toward the lowest point. Within days, doors that once opened for her stopped opening. The families she'd delivered babies for, the households she'd nursed through fevers, would cross to the other side of the street rather than greet her, not always out of belief, sometimes simply out of fear of being seen near her, of being pulled into the same suspicion by mere association. This is one of the quieter cruelties of the whole era, and one easy to overlook. The isolation often began before any trial, before any formal charge, before a single official had even reviewed the case. The community tried the woman first in whispers, long before any court did. She would have noticed the silence first. The way conversation stopped when she entered a room. The way the baker's wife, who'd shared bread with her for a decade, suddenly found reasons to be busy elsewhere. She would have felt it in her body before she understood it in her mind. That particular, hollow feeling of a room going quiet because of you. And here is the small, strange comfort some women found, if any comfort could be found at all. Many kept working anyway, kept tending their gardens, kept boiling their remedies, even for households too frightened to visit in daylight, but still willing to send a child at dusk, quietly, for a tincture nobody would admit to wanting. Life, even under suspicion, still needed to be lived. Bread still needed baking. Water still needed hauling. The body does not pause its needs simply because the mind is frightened. Still tired. Still home. Still hers, for now. But there was one part of the process that even her oldest friends, the ones who still, privately, believed in her innocence, would find themselves unable to speak of afterward. Something that happened once a formal accusation reached the hands of an examiner. Something the record keepers described in flat, procedural language, as though writing about weighing grain or measuring cloth, when what they were actually describing was something far harder to sit with. The record keepers wrote about it the way you'd write about weighing grain, flat, orderly, unemotional. But what they were describing, when you look closely, was the systematic process of convincing a frightened, exhausted woman to say the words her accusers wanted to hear. It rarely began with anything you'd recognize as violence. It began with sleep. An accused woman would be brought before an examiner, sometimes a local magistrate, sometimes a traveling official sent from a larger town, and questioned, not for an hour, sometimes for days in shifts, with different examiners taking turns while she was kept awake, kept upright, kept talking. The theory of the time held that a witch's familiar spirit needed rest to sustain her, so if she was never allowed to rest, her resolve would eventually break, and the truth, or what they believed was the truth, would surface on its own. And you can know what that does to a mind after the second night. The third, time stops behaving the way it should. Faces blur. Questions repeat themselves, and somewhere past the point of exhaustion, the difference between what happened and what you're being told happened starts to soften at the edges. This is worth pausing on gently because it explains something that otherwise seems impossible to understand. Why so many women, none of whom had done anything resembling what they were accused of, eventually said yes. Not because it was true. Because a mind starved of sleep for 4 days will often agree to almost anything that promises the questioning might finally stop. There was also, in many regions, a stranger ritual that came before any formal questioning at all, the search for a witch's mark. Examiners, sometimes trained specialists, who traveled from town to town for this exact purpose, paid a fee for each woman they examined, would look over every inch of a woman's body for any mole, birthmark, scar, or patch of skin that didn't respond normally to a pinprick. A third nipple, they called it sometimes, believing it was used to nurse a familiar spirit. A discolored freckle, a patch of skin gone slightly numb from age or old injury. Nearly every woman past the age of 40 has some mark like this somewhere on her body. That was the quiet, terrible logic of the search. It was built to find something, because something can always be found, if you look at any human body closely enough and are determined enough to see meaning in it. But there was one part of the whole process that even the most careful, gentle record keepers still struggled to describe without a strange formality creeping into their handwriting: the devices themselves. Let's speak of them plainly and gently, the way you'd describe an old, terrible tool now resting behind glass in a museum, dust settled into its joints, its purpose long since ended. The thumbscrew was simple in design: 2 metal plates, a screw between them, meant to be tightened slowly around a thumb or finger. It required no elaborate machinery, no special room. An examiner could carry one in a leather satchel from village to village, alongside his papers and his seal. Its entire purpose was patience, to apply just enough pressure, slowly enough, that a woman's resolve wore down before any lasting injury did. Most confessions extracted this way came not from the device's full use, but from a woman being shown the device and told, plainly, what would happen next if she didn't speak. The strappado was different, cruder, older, more commonly used by soldiers questioning captured men in wartime, but employed against accused women too, in some regions. A person's wrists were bound behind their back and attached to a rope thrown over a beam or pulley. They were then raised off the ground by their bound arms. The historical record shows that some women were left hanging for what witnesses described as the space of several Hail Marys said slowly. A strange, almost tender unit of time to use for something so brutal, but it tells you something about how the era measured its cruelty, not in minutes, but in prayers. And there was the water ordeal, perhaps the strangest of all because of its logic. A woman, bound at the wrists and ankles, would be lowered into a pond or river. If she floated, this was taken as proof that the water, blessed, pure, a symbol of baptism, had rejected her, meaning she carried some unnatural lightness or evil within her. If she sank, she was declared innocent. You may already feel the quiet horror folded into that logic. There was no way to pass the test that didn't first require nearly drowning. Innocence, in this particular ritual, looked identical to genuine danger. The women, pulled from the water quickly enough to survive, were the lucky ones. Not because the test had worked, but because someone standing at the water's edge had decided, that day, to pull the rope in time. Historians estimate these particular water trials were used less often than popular imagination believes. Many regions and many courts considered them unreliable, even by the standards of the time, and relied more heavily on prolonged questioning and the devices already mentioned. But where they were used, the same quiet cruelty ran underneath. A test bit built so that surviving it and failing it looked almost the same from the shore. It would be easy, hearing all this, to imagine every accused woman eventually broke and confessed to whatever was asked of her. Many did. But it's worth knowing gently that some did not. There are trial records, fewer than you'd hope, but they exist, of women who endured hours of questioning, who were shown the instruments, who were threatened with the water, and who simply quietly refused to say the words. Not out of dramatic defiance, out of something closer to exhaustion turned inward, a kind of stubborn stillness. One record from a small German court describes a woman answering every question for 2 full days with the same 4 words, "I know nothing more." Not shouted, not desperate, just repeated calmly, like a stone worn smooth by the same wave over and over. We don't know what happened to her afterward. The record ends there, incomplete. The rest of the page lost to time, or damp storage, or simple carelessness. But there's something quietly remarkable in what survives. A woman's voice, flat and certain, refusing to hand over a story that wasn't true, even when the truth was clearly not what anyone in that room wanted to hear. Still frightened, still alone in that room, but still, somehow, herself. There was, though, one particular kind of accusation that examiners treated differently from all the others. One that didn't rely on marks or devices at all, but on something far more ordinary and far harder to defend against. The testimony of children. An adult accuser needed a reason, a refused loan, a dead cow, a curdled bucket of milk. A child needed none of that at all. If a child said a woman had appeared at the foot of their bed in the night, pinching them, whispering to them, urging them to sign a mark in a book, that testimony was often taken more seriously than anything an adult witness could offer. Children, in the belief of the time, were thought too innocent to invent such elaborate lies. Their fear was treated as proof rather than as fear. Hi again, friends, if you've just settled back in. We're deep in the story now, so let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and let's continue gently from here. Because what happened next in these trials often turned on nothing more than a frightened child, a bad dream, and a room full of adults eager to believe. Picture a child of perhaps 8 or 9 years old, lying awake in a small shared bedroom, 2 or 3 siblings in the same bed, a single window letting in moonlight, the rest of the house creaking with the ordinary sounds old wooden houses make as they cool at night, a door settling, a beam contracting, the wind finding a gap somewhere in the thatch. To an adult, these sounds are simply a house being a house. To a child raised on stories of witches gathering in the woods at midnight, on whispered warnings from older cousins about the old woman down the lane who does things, these same sounds can become something else entirely. A shadow at the window becomes a visitor, a bad dream becomes a memory, and once a child says the words aloud to a parent, "She was here, she pinched me, she told me to come with her." There is very little room left for anyone in that house to say, gently, "Perhaps it was only a dream." Because to say that, in a village steeped in real fear of real witchcraft, would have felt like inviting danger back into the house. Far safer and far more comforting to believe the child, to take the story to the local magistrate, to have it written down. There's a strange gentleness worth noticing here, even inside something so unjust. Most parents who brought their children's accusations forward were not cruel. They were frightened for their child, in a world where illness could take a healthy toddler in 3 days, and no one could say why. If their child said a woman had visited them in the night, believing it and acting on it was, in its own way, an act of protection, misguided, devastating for the accused. But rooted, underneath, in love, once a child's testimony was taken formally, examiners had their own methods for drawing out more detail, and these methods, gentle as they may sound, compared to the thumbscrew or the strappado, carried their own quiet danger. A child would be asked leading questions, over and over, across multiple sessions, sometimes days apart. Did the woman have an animal with her? Did she carry anything in her hand? Was there anyone else present? Each time the child answered, the questions grew slightly more specific, slightly more detailed, built from whatever the child had said the previous time. Children wanting to please the adults, questioning them, wanting the sessions to end, would often begin filling in details, simply because a question seemed to expect one. By the 4th or 5th telling, a story that began as "I had a bad dream" could grow into a fully detailed account. A black cat, a silver dish, 3 other women standing in a circle at the edge of the wood, an oath sworn on a book, bound in something the child couldn't name. None of it had existed in the first telling. All of it had been built, one gentle leading question at a time, by adults who believed they were helping a frightened child find the words for something true. This is one of the saddest, softest cruelties in the entire record. Not malice, but a kind of accidental collaboration between a frightened child and an anxious, well-meaning adult, each one trying to make sense of the dark, each one, without meaning to, making the story worse. There is one case, recorded in careful court Latin, and later translated by historians, of a girl no older than 10 whose testimony helped convict 3 women in her village over the course of a single year. She had named the first woman after a nightmare. When that woman was arrested, the girl was asked gently if anyone had been with the woman in her dream, and so a second name emerged. Then, weeks later, a third. We don't know what became of that girl as an adult. The records that survive rarely follow accusers past the trials themselves. Only the accused are tracked through to their sentences, their fates recorded in the same flat, procedural hand used for everything else. But it's worth sitting, gently, with the thought of her, a child who likely never understood, not fully, what her words had done, who perhaps grew older and quieter, the way people do when a memory sits uneasily and is never quite spoken of again. Still a child, in her own house, in her own bed, and yet, somehow, holding more power over her neighbors' lives than any adult in that village. But there was one particular kind of accused woman who children's testimonies seem to find most often. Not a stranger, not someone from a distant farm, but someone startlingly close to home. Someone who had held the child, fed the child, perhaps even delivered the child into the world with her own 2 hands. It was rarely a stranger the children named. Far more often, it was someone they knew intimately, a grandmother, an aunt, a woman who had rocked them to sleep 100 times, who had pressed a warm poultice to their chest during a winter fever, whose hands they knew as well as their own mother's. This makes a strange kind of sense, if you sit with it gently. A child's nightmares are built from the faces they know best, and an old woman, someone who had lived long enough to be alone, to be poor, to be slightly strange in her habits, to sleep lightly and wander at odd hours because her joints ached too much to lie still, was, in the quiet architecture of a village's imagination, already halfway toward suspicion before a single accusation was ever spoken. Hi again, if you've drifted in and out. This is our last stop tonight, so let everything settle now. Your shoulders, your breathing, the last thoughts of your day. We'll finish gently, together. Picture her, 70 years old, perhaps older, though no one kept careful count of years back then, the way we do now. She lives with her daughter's family, in the smallest room of the house, near the hearth, because the warmth eases her joints at night. She minds the children while the parents work the fields or the market stall. She tells them stories by firelight. Old stories, the same ones her own grandmother told her, about forests and rivers and things that live at the edges of both. She is, in every ordinary sense, beloved. The children fall asleep against her shoulder. She hums to them in a low, cracked voice that has gone soft with age. Her hands, spotted and thin-skinned now, still know exactly how much salt to add to a broth, exactly how to bind a scraped knee with a strip of clean cloth. But she is also, in the quiet calculus of the era, precisely the kind of woman most likely to be named. Old, a little strange in her habits. Perhaps she talks to herself, or startles at sudden sounds, or wanders the yard at night because sleep no longer comes easily to an aging body. Dependent on her family, and therefore, in bad years, a burden someone quietly resents. And closest of all, physically, to the children whose nightmares might one day name her. There's something worth pausing on here, gently, the particular unfairness of it. The very things that made her valuable, her nearness, her care, her long familiarity with the children, were the same things that made her vulnerable. Love and suspicion, in her case, were built from the exact same proximity. When such a woman was accused, the arrest itself was often almost tender in its ordinariness. Not soldiers breaking down a door in the night. Often, simply, the village constable. A neighbor himself. Someone who'd known her 30 years. Arriving at the house in daylight, apologetic in his manner, asking her to come with him, because the magistrate needed to speak with her. She might have been given a moment to fetch a shawl, to kiss a grandchild's head. to bank the fire so it wouldn't go out while she was away. Still thinking, perhaps, that she'd be home again by evening. Many were not. We know, from surviving records across the era, that thousands of women across Europe were tried on charges of witchcraft between the late 1400s and the early 1700s, and that a significant portion of them, historians differ on the exact ratio by region and decade, did not survive their trials. Some were released, their accusers' resolve failing under the weight of what they were asking a court to believe. Some recanted their confessions the moment the immediate threat of questioning had passed, though a recantation rarely undid a sentence once it had been recorded. And some, the ones the histories remember with the heaviest hearts, went to their deaths still insisting, in whatever way they were still permitted to speak, that they had done nothing at all. It's worth saying gently here, because it matters. Almost none of what these women were accused of had actually happened. No curses, no midnight gatherings in the wood, no pacts, no marks, no familiars. What actually happened was smaller and sadder and entirely human. A bad harvest, a sick child, a frightened village, a grandmother who happened to be nearby. And yet, somewhere in all of this, in the thumbscrews resting quietly now behind museum glass, in the trial records gone soft and brown with age, in the 4 words, one unnamed woman repeated for 2 straight days, there is something that has outlasted the fear that built it. The healer's remedies, the ones passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, for generations before anyone thought to write them down. Some of them still exist today, half forgotten, half remembered, folded into the herbal teas and old family cures many of us still reach for on a hard night. The grandmother's lullabies, hummed low by firelight to children who grew old themselves, and hummed the same songs to children of their own. None of that needed a trial to survive. It only needed to be quietly, stubbornly passed along. So tonight, as you drift, you might think of her. The woman by the fire, the healer in her small cottage, the one's history tried and failed and sometimes could not silence completely. Frightened once, alone sometimes, and yet, somehow, still remembered. Gently, all these years later, by someone lying in the dark, listening to her story. If this story kept you company tonight, you're welcome to like or subscribe, but only if it felt worth it. No pressure at all. Right now, let the fire in your mind burn low. Let the wind outside settle. Let everything that needed saying tonight finally be said. See leave well.